Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Welcome, listeners. Today's guest on the podcast is Dr. Mary Jane Ballou, a distinguished church musician and contributor to the Church Music Association of America's journal, Sacred Music.
Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, Mary Jane.
Well, I'm happy to participate.
So let's dive right in. A lot of our listeners have questions about the best way to help a parish music program grow or head in a new direction. And you give advice about this topic that's so relatable, both in terms of understanding the psychology and dynamics at play in a parish music program, but also in taking things step by step as you might encounter them in a real life situation. So at the beginning of a process of outlining a sort of pastoral plan for growing a parish music program or making changes in an existing program, what would you say to a music director and a pastor about working on such a project? And what do they need to understand about each other's roles and the effects that changes have on a parish?
I think what you need to do at the beginning when you've decided you want to do better than what you have is you really have to first sit down and think where you are right now. Otherwise, you're like getting in the car and telling maps to take you somewhere without letting them know your current location. So you have to go through and you have to think what's good in your parish, what's not so good in the music. You have to think about what's been done in the past, what is the style, what kind of singers do you have? What kind of music is in the choir room? I certainly hope at this point no one is violating copyright laws, but I've seen cabinets that have an unfortunate number of Xeroxes in them. I think you have to think, do you still have a folk mass, so-called? What's the flavor at your different masses? And let's say you say, oh, well, I'm going to take it all the way up. We're going to be doing the propers in no time at all. Whoa, Nelly. Are you up to that? Did you just discover Gregorian chant yesterday? Because if you don't know things well, you can't teach them. You cannot teach what you do not know. So you may need to do some work yourself before you even launch into this plan.
Right. That's so important. Like we talk about formation often for our parishioners or our choir members or something, but first and foremost, your pastor has to be well formed in sacred music, and you yourself have to be formed in sacred music. And formation is more than just learning about it or reading one church document and seeing what the church is asking for, right? It's kind of like marinating in the music before you really understand the spiritual consequences of it and what it's really about.
I think that's true. And I think you really have to develop a concept of what liturgy is. And the person that's going to help you develop the concept of what liturgy is in your parish is the pastor. Now, some people say, oh, the pastor, he doesn't care about music. He told me that. He doesn't care about music. I would be very, very wary of that stance because you need to know what he likes and what he doesn't like or where he wants to go before you think of implementing any changes. Or you're going to find out how much he cares about music when he starts getting voicemail messages from people who don't like what you've planned, or don't like what you're doing. So you have to make sure that you and the pastor are really on the same page. Does improving the music, improving the liturgy, it may mean one thing to you and something entirely different to the pastor.
So along that vein, what would you say to a music director who feels like their pastor would be on board with talking about these things and maybe heading in a different direction or something, but maybe they don't know that much about the church's teachings on sacred music? What's the best way to go about heading in the direction that the church is directing us together with a pastor? Or maybe a pastor has a musician who doesn't know very much about the church's teachings on sacred music, but might be open to learning about it.
I think it's a matter, if you're dealing with the pastor, you have to be very careful. The pastor is ultimately the person who is completely responsible for the liturgical celebrations in his church. and he does not want to be lectured. He doesn't want to be spoken down to by some musical know-it-all who actually may not know all that much anyway. And I think you have to say, well, for one thing, before you go and talk to the pastor, you have a written and reviewed by you plan of the steps you want to take. If you just go in and say, gee, Father, I really want to make things better here, and he'll go, oh, okay. No, you need to be able to explain it and to justify it and bring him along and tell him, but don't give him a bunch of articles to read. He has enough to do. He's probably running what's basically almost like a small nonprofit organization. He has accountants and he has receptionists and he has the DRE and he has all these people, and you are one of those people. And what you do is very important, but he's got a lot of other things going on at the same time. So you have to sort of see how does he like to learn things? And then just make little steps. Say, one little step that a lot of people use is they find English settings of the propers and say Father Weber's or Lumen Christi or any number of other ones that are around. And all they take is, for example, the introit, they sing it as a prelude. And then there's the entrance here. That's a first step. So you have to figure out what is the best first step. And you have to explain it to him. And he may not know. I've met priests who had exactly one semester, one course, one semester long in liturgy in seminary. And that's all they know.
So what about the opposite situation where a pastor, maybe he did have a good formation in the sacred liturgy and sacred music, and he's coming into a situation where his parish music program needs a little bit of revitalization, and maybe the musicians aren't very interested in it because they've done things the same way for so long, and what the pastor might be talking about sounds like a lot of work or something. How does a pastor go about encouraging growth in a sacred music program?
I think if the pastor is clear on what he wants, and he should talk to the music director, and then after they've come to an understanding of what he wants to achieve, and remember, he is the person who can make that determination, he and the music director together should talk to the choir, to the cantors, if there's going to be a change in how you use cantors, because people need to think it's important and times have changed, and he has to be able to explain why he wants to make his changes. He can refer to documents, but again, only in a very kind of light way. Again, if you hand the choir members copies of church documents, they're probably not going to go anywhere. And, what is he going to do if half the choir quits? Let's say half the choir quits. What should the pastor do? Does he back up? No, he doesn't, because he'll replace them with the people who are sitting in the pews who probably didn't want to sing or do what was being done previously. So everybody has to really be prepared to be strong. And that's all.
That's really good advice. I liked what you mentioned with presenting a plan written down to the pastor, particularly because he has so many other things and you're just one on the list, and it helps to, I would imagine, just organize his thoughts about what does the music director need. Having a preliminary plan that can be adjusted is so much easier to work with than having to draw up a plan initially from his perspective. So do you think that, say, new music director comes in, the pastor's filling out the music director and vice versa, do you think making an initial plan and then revisiting it, I don't know, quarterly, whatever, would be generally a good framework for pastors and musicians to work with?
Yes, I think one of the reasons for having a plan, and a good plan that's written and thought through, is if you go to basically a manager, which is what a pastor is to some extent, don't go and say what the problem is. Go with the solution.
Exactly.
And say, okay, let's see where we are, and arrange when you're going to make your changes, do your changes at what the congregation, the choir, everyone perceives as change points. whether it's the beginning of Advent or the beginning of Lent. Those are your two opportunities to change things. One of the advantages of doing it at Advent is that the Gloria goes away. And if you've had a problem with a kind of a bongo drum Gloria, or one that has a refrain and maybe it's time to do a through-sung one, let's have people forget about it for a while. And it is a season where things are expected to be different. So I think you do it then and it's okay. Now, you do have to think about what you're going to do on Christmas and what you're going to do on Easter, because those are always the particular cases where people, A, show up for the choir, and B, show up in the congregation that you haven't seen since the last one of those holidays. But that's kind of a separate issue. If you're talking about long-term improvement with the folks that are there day after week, that's what you're looking at. And yeah, sometimes you can just go a lot faster and further than you think. Don't say, oh, well, no, I have it on my schedule that we're not going to add the communion verse until November 12th. No, if it's working, it's working. One thing I would say in terms of if you're the new director, find out, ask. That's the only way you're going to find out why the prior director left. You need to know that. Otherwise, you are going to walk in to a choir room and there's going to be landmines scattered all over the floor that you don't know about. Now, maybe he just retired. There are situations where the pastor wanted to make things better. The prior director resisted and was summarily dismissed. And the choir is furious. You need to know that, because you're gonna have a different tack when you deal with them than if everybody's happy.
Following up with working with a new choir, you wrote an article in the journal Sacred Music, and you were talking about the first choir rehearsal and, making new impressions, starting the new job, and you gave a list of helpful suggestions. Do this, make sure you don't do this, to try to get off on the right foot and avoid scaring them away, trying to present something as very foreign or whatever. Can you talk about the advice you gave?
Sure. The advice I gave in that article is that if you're the new director, you're coming into a choir in most circumstances that is made up of volunteers. And they are not highly trained singers. They are people who like to sing in the choir. Maybe they've sung in the choir for a long time. And when you come in, what you need to do is be interested in them, care about them. You obviously need to know how well they sing. But if you say you're going to check out people's voices, I can guarantee you that half the choir won't be there the next week, because they're not interested in being embarrassed. They're adults. They're volunteers. They can go back in the pew and sit with the rest of the family. They can find another choir. You need to remember that. And the thing is, you can't direct a choir without a choir. The thing is, they're people, they're individuals, and your first concern should be to connect with them on a human level, not just a musical level. The problem is, especially with younger directors, is they've come out of music school or they've come out of their choral program, and they're used to singing with people who can sight sing. They're used to singing where everybody, when the director says, turn to page 7, everybody turns to page 7. They're used to people getting docked if they don't attend. This is an entirely different environment. And I think a lot of young directors, or new directors, you can be a new director, new to the business and not necessarily be young, will crash and burn in their first job because they don't recognize that difference. And I think it's very critical that, for example, you should greet them at the door. That sounds like an easy thing to do. Not be standing over by a music stand fussing with a pile of stuff and mumbling under your breath. No, you're at the door. You're there early, and you are at the door when they come in, and you hand them a file card and their very own little pencil, and tell them, welcome. I'm Captain Hook and I'm here to direct the choir. So head on over and take a seat. I'm happy to meet you, and play an icebreaker game. You get their cards back with their contact information, so you can put that in your computer, and you shuffle those cards and you call on people and ask them tell you a little about themselves. You don't know anything about them probably, except that they're in that room with you. And then they're people. And when they finish telling you something, and if they're very shy, you can always ask them their favorite food or their favorite color or whatever. And then say thank you and their name. Because one thing you have to do is learn their names. And this is so critical in that first meeting. They're people.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think that's a part of the formation in sacred music. Even if you think about it from a theological perspective, the church documents say that the purpose of sacred music is the glorification of God and also the sanctification and edification of the faithful. Or if you read like St. Thomas Aquinas, he's always talking about the effect that these things have on people to open them up to grace, to open them up to prayer, to facilitate an interior act of worship and also an exterior act of worship. And if you're coming into it only as an idea, you're removing people, which is fundamentally at odds with God's salvation plan. God came to save us in reality and not just in theory. So if we really believe that the church's teachings on sacred music are a beautiful, life-giving thing through which we can receive God's grace and through which the church can teach us how to pray better, this idea of really connecting with individual people is absolutely vital to helping them see these things for themselves.
Right. I think that's very true. And people don't appreciate what a great psychologist St. Thomas Aquinas was. He really was centuries ahead of everyone else in recognizing that we are there as a church, as a group, but we are still individuals. And you should share something about yourself with the group. And if you always like to be called Freddie, let them know that. And make sure that your contact information is up on a whiteboard in big letters, so the bases in the back can see something. And people can take a picture of it or they can write it down. A lot of times now people just photograph stuff like that with their phone, and it's very easy. Then what you do is you can, start a rehearsal, do a little bit of a warm-up. You've used a lot of time on that. You keep the music for the first week very simple. And can they sing in parts? Many church choirs now cannot. So don't go, banging your head on the floor. Just, okay, then that means you're going to go home and you're going to really think about how do you develop a choir into a choir that can sing in parts. That's a whole special discussion of its own. And if they're used to singing in parts, then you run something very simple that has very homophonic movement. The thing I learned from the years I directed in Russian Orthodox choirs, which sing virtually continuously throughout very lengthy services, is you can teach people to sing very lovely 4-part harmony. And they don't have to be geniuses. They don't have to be great singers. What you do is you teach it to them and you don't overwhelm them and you stay with things. That's another point. If you and the pastor want changes going down the line, don't make something new every week. It's like the music directors hate doing hymns over again. Oh, we did Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past. We just do that all the time and all the time. Well, guess what? It's a chestnut because people like it. And people like to sing familiar hymns. People like to have enough time with a setting of the Holy Holy or the Sanctus, whether it's a choral setting or a chant setting. They need enough time to be comfortable with it. Don't, oh, well, we've done that for 3 weeks now. Now it's time for something else. No. Your capacity for boredom may be a lot different from your singers and the congregation, especially for Catholic musicians who come in and maybe are playing or working through 2, 3, 4 masses in the course of a weekend. And by that last one at 5 o'clock on Sunday evening, you may feel like your ears are bleeding. But hey, they only came to one. if you come into a situation, which I've seen very often in this part of the country, down in the South, is people will attempt to field a choir at every Mass. And unless you've got a very, very large number of singers, it is a very bad idea, because you end up with these random assortments of parts at any given Mass. So the person who always comes to the 11 o'clock suddenly decides this Sunday she's going to come to the 5 o'clock because she's got a brunch engagement. Or the person who goes to the 5 doesn't come at all, or decides to come to Saturday evening. I would rather have one good choir. The gentleman who was the director of the choir at the cathedral, I think it's St. James Cathedral in Seattle, said a lot of people basically do what he called potluck choirs. You just never know quite what's going to show up. And that's really not the way to get anything done. And that's something that I think is a good thing a pastor and a music director should agree on, and then come to terms with what they want to do. If you've got multiple Masses, which most Catholic parishes have, what are you going to do with the other Masses?
A sort of reverse situation, for example, that we have here in the Northeast is that it's a very cantor heavy situation where, most parishes have paid cantors. Actually, I came from the Midwest, and there it was very, very weird for a cantor ever to get paid. But in the Northeast, it's kind of a standard sort of thing. And you have parishes that are almost completely running on cantors, or maybe they have a choir, but the choir just is like a random group of people that shows up to sing for Mass. And they just come before Mass because they like singing together, and they always go to the same Mass, and it's a sort of social experience for them. And they maybe do a decent job of leading people in the melodies, but they're not singing choral music. So let's say you're in a situation where the pastor hired you as a choir director, and you've got this really cantor heavy or hodgepodgey situation, and you're tasked with coming in and building up a choir, but you might have like some psychological barriers in the parish or amongst the cantors that prejudice them against choirs because no one wants to give up their cantering. What would you say about that?
I think it is difficult. I have been around churches where somehow over the years the choir had disappeared. And yes, you basically had one person who handled everything, or a couple of people. Now, if they're paid, that is a much more sensitive situation, because then are you going to put somebody out of a job? If you want to build a choir, can you take some of those cantors and turn them, are they possible section leaders? That's one possibility, and you would still pay them and demand that they show up with the kind of regularity, but they're not going to be special anymore. And even in the world of volunteer cantors, they feel that's a very special position and very important to them. Some churches will require that if, for example, they want to use a cantor for the responsorial psalm, that's fine, but the cantor must also sing with the choir and attend the choir rehearsals and be an active contributor to that. And then again, if you focus your choir on one Mass, you're not going to disturb too many of them, but you really have to walk very carefully, and you will find that there are people who will tell you, I was always a cantor before Father fill in the name came, and then he said I couldn't sing anymore. There's a lot of tension that goes with that in the world of volunteer cantors. If they're paid and they're not on the payroll anymore, they tend to disappear. So that's not a problem with them. But if you're paying them, they better be darn good and very, very reliable.
You mentioned introducing changes to the choir and the congregation and trying to keep them engaged throughout that. What would you say are some reasonable changes for music directors and pastors to decide? Let's say the scenario is a typical parish in your experience, so you can work from that. What would be some reasonable first steps?
Reasonable first steps to me are improving your selection of hymns, but doing it again without saying, we aren't going to sing any more of that trash you people have been singing. No, instead, just change the selection. You and the pastor can agree if you wish to go towards more traditional hymns, if you wish to go for hymns that are more prayerful. That's pretty painless and generally can go down quite well. Again, I think also, for example, if you want to start a little bit of working on propers, you're going to need to explain to the choir what a proper is. So you better know, and you better have good answers lined up for you, questions you're going to get. And that again is something that's simple and easy, and don't do anything that is going to make the Mass last longer.
Yeah.
Because you'll get more complaints about that than about the selection of music. If you want, you can start tucking things in to the spaces that are available, that are there. If you have better instruments, if you have an organ and know how to use it, use it. And if you don't know how to use it and you have one, go take some lessons. And there's an enormous amount of wonderful music for manuals only. So saying, I don't know what to do with the pedals, doesn't let you off all the way. But I think you want to do these little things. Don't get up at the end of Mass and tell people how you're changing everything. Don't have the pastor get up at the end of Mass and tell people how everything is changing, because most people don't even process the music that consciously. And if you draw their attention to it, you're setting yourself up. So just make these little changes. And again, the pastor has to be prepared when he does get the calls from somebody who says, I just can't stand this. I think this is horrible. We're going back to the 50s. He has to have a response that says, this is the way I want to go.
So do you think there's a balance between, say, catechizing via little articles in the bulletin about, say, some bigger issues? I know pastors who have done this, say, if they're going to offer the Mass ad orientem during Advent, for example, or doing sacred music seminars or something about bigger things versus every single change and an announcement about it, so that everyone has the feeling that things are constantly changing, there's no stability, everything's in flux. What would you say as far as some advice operating that balance?
I think that's a very good point. Now, I think you can put short things in the bulletin. That's good. I think people do read the bulletin, even though in most churches, for some reason, at the end of Mass, they seem to read the bulletin out loud to the congregation. But you can put things in there. You could offer something on sacred music, just a lecture, heavily illustrated with slides and sound. Do that, but I don't know how successful it would be if you didn't do it when people were already there for something else. You could do it after maybe whatever your main Mass is, because generally there's a break before you start again, or do it after the Sunday evening Mass. It's very difficult now to get people to come back out. So you need to bear that in mind, or unless you're going to offer them a ton of free food. That might work, but you have to use your time and their time very judiciously. And you, as a director, as a musician, are keenly interested in this topic.
There's also the issue of a pastor showing his interest in the topic by simply preaching about it. I mean, when was the last time you ever heard a homily about music? And that kind of means something if the pastor's never preaching about music or the sacred liturgy, and helping people understand, like as Peter was saying, these big issues about how to pray, how to worship, what does active participation really mean? What's the role of interior silence in your life and in the reception of the sacraments and worship and all those sorts of things, you know?
I think it's good if they do that. I think a lot of them have this sense there was a directive that they're supposed to preach on the readings, so they use that as their, I have to preach on the readings. Well, yes, you can take care of that and then go on to something else. And I think it is important, because I remember someone saying, I think it was Jonathan Gaspar from the Archdiocese of Boston, who said, it's a good thing to remember that for most of the people at Mass, that 1 hour a week is their entire spiritual life. That's it. And that is your one chance to show them beauty. It's your one chance to tell them the truths of the religion. It's your one chance. And sometimes I don't think it's used as well as it could be, especially in homilies. And, nobody wants to be lectured endlessly, but I think it is good. And I think if you have a priest who wants things to be better, he hopefully will be willing to do that.
Well, this has been so helpful, Mary Jane. We're so grateful that you were able to join us, and we have more questions that I think you would be great at answering. So we hope to have you back on the show.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed thinking about these things. I always enjoy writing about them because when I think about them, I think of all the experiences I've had and what I've heard from all the other long-suffering singers, directors, priests, and people in the pews, and try and make things better with as little pain as possible. My favorite Catholic expression is, well, I'm going to go at 9:00 because then it'll be over with by 10, and I will have taken care of that. Mass is something you get over with, like I'm going to get over the laundry or something.
Then I have all day free, right?
Right, yes. We want to make it so that isn't the sentiment. We want them to say, oh, this is the high point of my week. It may take a while to get there, though, and you have to be patient. Festina lente.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think a lot of our listeners, both from the pastor's perspective and the musicians, will really benefit from this. And then maybe for some of our listeners who are neither, just interested, I think it's kind of helpful for them to understand what their musicians at their parish are thinking about, what their work involves, and help them with that.
Yeah, I think that's great. Well, thank you for letting me share my opinions and my experience, and I hope that Square Notes flourishes forever.
Et in secula seculorum. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much.
Mary Jane has some really great insights and practical suggestions from her years of experience as a church musician. I hope this discussion today was helpful for you, whether practically or even just in giving a greater understanding of some of the hurdles people face when trying to do their part to make church music better reflect God's beauty and truth. Thank you for listening to the podcast and especially for writing us reviews. The reviews on iTunes particularly help us get more people aware of the podcast by increasing its ranking. We'll see you next time on Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.